From the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraka-Lincoln, this is Nebraska Farmcast. I'm Ryan Evans. The higher interest rates that were established to counter inflation a couple years ago are persisting into 2024, continuing to affect agricultural producers. On this episode, we'll hear how these economic pressures are impacting crop production, machinery purchases, and cattle herd rebuilding efforts. How do these rates stack up historically, and what do they mean for producers who are trying to navigate these financial challenges this year and next? Dr. Jay Parsons is a professor of agricultural economics and director of the Center for Agricultural Profitability here at UNL, and he co-authored a new article discussing this issue for Right Risk News, and he joins me now for more. Hi, Jay.
Hey, Ryan. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for being here again. So there seemed to be an expectation maybe that some people had that, or maybe just hopeful, that we might see interest rates start to lower this year. Can you explain the situation and how we got here with interest rates now?
Yeah, well, we saw inflation bump up a couple of years ago with a lot of the stimulus money that came out as a result of COVID and the pandemic and the economic situation that we saw. And then we saw the supply chain issues happen too. So the result was some pretty high inflation, at least high for recent times. And then our Federal Reserve started raising interest rates to try to bring that down. And I guess it's fair to say the inflation's persisted a little bit longer than people thought it would. We were on a downward trajectory. It seems to kind of stalled out. They target 2% inflation. We're up in that 3.5% range, and so expectations were that by the last half of this year we'd start to see interest rates being back down in response to inflation being back down around that 2%. Now we're not quite so sure how quickly those interest rates are going to come down or not.
And the article mentions that the crop sector is seeing increased farm operating loan activity with smaller cash buffers and higher input costs. So can you talk about how these high interest rates are specifically impacting crop producers and their financial decisions? Yeah,
well, crop producers really got, with what I mentioned with the inflation stuff, they really got hit hard with that because we had some issues with fertilizer costs going up and a lot of things just on the input side. And then in addition to that, now we got a lot of upward pressure on machinery costs too. So a lot of those costs, things that they would spend money on, have become much more expensive for them to purchase. And then on top of that, almost all of them carry a significant operating note as they incur all those expenses at planting time and then don't reap the benefits to harvest time. And then when you have marketing of that crop that's harvested taking place over a number of months too, it can take a while to pay down some of those operating notes. So they're particularly vulnerable to these high interest rates.
Are there strategies that farmers are using or can use to manage these rising machinery costs, equipment costs, and high interest rates while still maintaining their important operations in their business?
Yeah, well, for the most part, the default strategy right now is to delay purchases. And that might be, a person might argue, well, that's obvious default strategy at any time. But last time, a decade or so ago, we saw some situations where we had higher interest costs too and whatnot. They had some options there because, let me back up a little bit. So if we think back to when we had some crashing prices, I would say a decade ago or so, and there was some pressure in the crop sector, just in profitability and needing to borrow money or whatnot. They had some strategies there in terms of refinancing some of that short-term debt into longer-term debt because we did have mortgage rates that were pretty low at that time. Those options aren't there for them right now because this higher interest rate environment has crept into that mortgage situation, so they don't have that equity that they can draw down from on their land mortgages to basically supplement these purchase costs that they have. So that kind of limits their options. It pretty much boils down to basically cutting down on those costs that they might be spending money on.
That makes sense. And in the cattle industry, then, you've had a lot of drought conditions out there, thinning out herds. So as those producers look to rebuild, is there any effect from high interest rates that are impacting that ability to recover and rebuild?
Yeah, well, the cattle industry right now, because of all the stuff that happened with the drought in particular, on top of all of this other stuff that we talked about, their impact on the drought that cut down drastically just on cattle inventory numbers. They have extremely high prices right now overall, which is good if you're selling cattle. But if you're, as you said, if you're trying to rebuild a herd, well, you're trying to buy in some cows and or hold back some heifers, delay sales, and those become quite expensive. So when you're doing that on borrowed money, or actually having a note someplace that you're not paying back, say, quite as quickly because you're retaining more heifers, that kind of stuff, it can be pretty expensive to build back a herd in an environment like this. So there's not any great strategies for that, other than it's a tough, it's a tough road to hoe at this point if you're looking to build your herd back.
Can you talk about how the current interest rate environment compares to past periods, and what lessons might be able to be learned from those historical trends?
Yeah, well, it is interesting because we look at it now in terms of being high interest rates. And when this first started going up, people kept referencing back to the 80s and extremely high interest rates that we saw, especially in the early 80s. We're not back at those numbers, but you go back 15 years ago, right before our financial crisis, 08, 09, we had these kind of interest rates back then. And that's really when the Fed made the conscious decision to cut interest rates in order to stimulate the economy. And so the interest rates themselves we've seen not that long ago, 15 years ago. But probably the biggest thing that makes this so remarkable is we had a very sustained period with super low interest rates, historically low interest rates. And then over a period of a couple of years, they've gone extremely high. So it's not so much where we're at today as much as it is where we came from not that long ago, and the fact that it was persistent at that low level for quite a few years prior to that.
Yeah. And in your article, you do mention that high interest rates, while they're problematic, shouldn't be the primary issue that producers are concerned about. So can you just explain what you mean by that, and what is the more pressing issue, and perhaps how that can be managed right now? Yeah,
well, I jokingly tell my colleagues that, interest rates aren't a problem if you're not borrowing money, right? I mean, that's a simple thing. So on that premise, though, if you stop and you think about that, well, you got to borrow money to cover those costs. And that's probably the biggest deal right now is we do have some pretty high costs to cover. And so we're kind of forced into that boat of borrowing money to do business and grow crops, et cetera. So it's that cost side of the equation that's probably the biggest concern, because the interest is just a percentage of that over time. But, if you can save money and do things more efficiently on the cost side, that's going to really make a big difference for you overall. And that's probably where you want to focus more so than fretting about interest rates themselves. Yeah. Is work on those costs so you don't have to borrow quite as much money and help on that cash flow side.
And I believe you use the phrase "cash flow is king" toward the end of the article. Yeah. So what other advice would you give producers to help them navigate the next couple of years, or however long you might see this interest rate situation taking? Well,
the advice I always give producers in general is to work hard at the business side of the business. And what I mean by that is not take the fun out of farming and ranching. We don't want to do that, but don't take vacations from being a businessman. So crises like these, when interest rates go up or something's going on the cost side that you really need to address, and you see, hey, this could be a problem, I need to do something about it. That's one way to handle it, but that's very frustrating. A better way to handle it is to constantly be on top of the business as you go through time, even the good times. Mm-hmm. What's the best use of my money? How much capital do I need to have around to cover some potentially unexpected expenses, those types of things. So the best advice I can give is stay on top of it, even in the good times. Don't wait till the crisis comes up, and because it'll help you be prepared for that better, so that you're not reliant on borrowed money, because you always do have a backup plan, so to speak, and then work with that positive thought in mind that, I am a business owner here, and it's an ongoing part of what I do.
Well, great advice from Dr. Jay Parsons, director of the Center for Agricultural Profitability, and you can find his article from Right Risk News republished on our website, cap.unl.edu. Thanks, Jay.
Thanks, Ryan.
Nebraska Farmcast is a production of the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. For the latest research-based information and education resources to manage your farm or ranch operation, visit our website at cap.unl.edu. That's cap.unl.edu.